All right, in our last video, we talked about imperialism and some of the struggles, benefits, although more struggles and dec- things that aren't good about imperialism. And we talked about three factors, and some of those factors being positive factors for protection and for trade, economics, and obviously some factors being more racist in their overall viewpoints. So we've talked about that. So let's go ahead and dive into a little bit more about certain factors of imperialism and real life events. Now, guys, let's just be honest. We have most of our country dealing with, the reason that we have our country is because we had kind of an imperialistic westward expansion mindset. And from that point on, we kind of expanded out from there. And Hawaii is a good reason why we have Hawaii is because we were imperialistic and we wanted it as an economic growth and also as military wise because we were needing to have a central location in the Pacific that we could fill up our ships with whether coal or fuel, different things, obviously food sources, and then we could go to our the rest of our country and protect. So let's go ahead and start with the idea of Hawaii. Now, Queen Liliuokalani, yes, I have practiced that name. Liliuokalani was basically, she was against the expansion of or use of her island. Now, her brother actually was in favor and had a much better working relationship with the United States political class, but he passed away, and she became queen, and she was very much a resentment of U.S. power in Hawaii. And so, instead of United States saying, "Well, let's work with you," they basically took power and control, and they used some very underhanded tactics in order to do that. And it's kind of sad. There's you talked about sugar stuff here, so the problem was there was a guy named Sanford B. Dole. Yes, Dole, that guy that you see on a Dole banana. He asked the U.S. to annex Hawaii, and Benjamin Harrison actually would. Did not get approved, could not get the Senate, and Grover Cleveland was actually upset about that. McKinley, well, he was more of a imperialistic president, and he wanted to actually bring more people into the fold, as it were, in the United States. And he proclaimed Hawaii a U.S. territory in 1898. Obviously, later on became a state in the 50s. And Hawaii does give the U.S. an important seaport, and of course the Pearl Harbor, which later on becomes a scene of a pretty tragic incident in the World War II area, right? And so this is a good video talking about Hawaii. So I would encourage you to watch it. This is another video that talks about the treaty between the U.S. and Hawaii Islands. Now, let's talk about Cuba, because Cuba is only, basically less than 100 miles off the coast of the Florida Panhandle, and obviously America had an economic interest because it was a territory of Spain. So Cuban citizens did rebel against Spain, and the United States actually supported that rebellion. Now, it's the interesting thing is we also Spain had some other territories in the Pacific Islands, which is kind of interesting because they're on the other side of the ocean, right? The Atlantic Ocean. And so they had some interest in Puerto Rico and not Puerto Rico, but in the Philippines, and so they definitely were spread out quite a bit, and so it was in the best interest, at least in America's thought process at the time, to get involved in that. Now we did get involved, but we did in a way that was kind of underhanded as well. So we have what we call yellow journalism. This idea. William Randolph Hearst, who famous for the Hearst Castle on the California coastline, and Joseph Pulitzer, yes, that Pulitzer, the Pulitzer Prize, they really wanted to focus on stirring up the hearts and minds and emotions, more especially, of American people. And so there was not a lot of researched news. It was more eye-catching headlines. I wonder where I've heard that. Kind of like clickbait today. Their whole idea was to sell more newspapers, all right? And so this was basically exaggerating the situation in Cuba, furthering urging Americans to support Cuban independence from Spain. Here's an example of how this happens, right? Hearst says, you furnish the pictures and I'll furnish the war. Yikes, right? So it's, media bias is not necessarily something that is new, right? It's something that has gone on. So he says, please remain. You furnish the pictures and I'll furnish the war. And he's basically saying, whatever you capture, I'll spin it to make it fit my narrative or the narrative that I want. Because the more news is out there, the more papers he sells and the richer he becomes, all right? So this is a Hearst Castle, a couple of videos on this, kind of interesting. So one of the biggest things that happens is the sinking of the USS Maine. Now, so this is a letter, the Delome letter was written by a Spanish diplomat to the United States, which criticizes McKinley, causing, of course, more anti-Spanish sentiment. And then there's an explosion, and people say, well, the Spanish either sent a torpedo or there was a mine that was laid out by the Spanish. But we actually know that that is not the case today. There's been several different experiments that have proven without a doubt that the explosion actually came from within the ship itself, and it was just an accident. It was just a horrific accident. But a lot of sailors did perish in this blast, and this is kind of that final straw. And both Hearst and Pulitzer use this as this call to go to war with Spain, and their advocates use the term "Remember the Maine, to hell with Spain" as that battle cry. So this is the sinking of the USS Maine in Savannah Harbor. A couple of videos, and then they did go back and look at some of the ideas of this. Now this is a very short war. It's called the Splendid Little War by a couple of people because it really didn't have a lot of death as far as wars go on really either side, but really American side, very limited casualties. A lot of them actually came from issues dealing with sicknesses, right? So the war actually begins in the Philippines. Wait a second, that was in the Pacific Ocean. How in the world did we get over there so fast, guys? I think it was already maybe planned at this point. It was just a convenient excuse to start with the whole remember the Maine thing, all right? So George Dewey, successful to taking control of the Philippine Islands, called the Battle of Manila Bay, and Dewey is the only person to have attained the rank of Admiral of the Navy. It's kind of like the General of the Armies kind of deal, all right? So there is a pretty important battle that happens during this time, and this is a pretty famous battle. It's called the Battle of San Juan Hill, and a lot of people put Theodore Roosevelt as somebody that was the main leader of this and the charge of San Juan Hill. Again, not necessarily the truth. He actually led the Rough Riders up Kettle Hill, but it was not necessarily him. But why stop the media from actually reporting the facts? It was a good narrative, and Teddy Roosevelt was a pretty popular guy at the time, and it really did put him up on the limelight of on his role to becoming vice president and then later on president. So this is the Teddy Roosevelt and the Rough Riders, a video that talks about and these are guys that from the Southwest area, pretty rough, but that was what they did. That was who they were. All right. So last but not least for today's video, you've got the Treaty of Paris. Now this is the third Treaty of Paris. This is kind of apparently a lot of people like to sign treaties in Paris. It's a beautiful city, right? So this is ends the Spanish-American War. Under the treaty, Spain grants Cuba independence, turns over Guam and Puerto Rico to the United States, kind of like as protectorates, and sold the Philippines to the U.S., marked the beginning of the U.S. as a world power. And John Hay, who is the Secretary of State at the time, calls the war a splendid little war because it was very short, only 15 weeks of actual fighting, and the U.S. gained a lot of territory from the war. But now, there is a problem. what do we do with those territories? What do we do with territories gained during war? Do we make them states? Do we make them their own nation? That was the whole idea of Cuba, saying, "Hey, I want to, get out underneath the yoke of Spanish oppression, and they want to have their own nation." Well, what do we do here? So there's a shift in the whole imperialism. What do we do? The anti-imperialists kind of come back into power a little bit, and they say, hey, we don't need to have all this new territory. They need to be their own nation. They need to be their own. So now this next video that we're going to be talking about, it's going to deal with what do these nations do and how the United States impact them. And of course, 100 years later, we're still dealing with some of the issues that related to Cuba and some of the decisions that are made now, and even the Philippines. Do we make them? Are they still protectorate? Did they fight against us? All that. Of course, the Puerto Rico is a protectorate or under our protection, but they're not necessarily a state. Although they have decided to, say, hey, we want to be a state, but now we're still in the midst of how do we make that a state? Do we have Washington D.C. a state? All that stuff is still even playing out even today. So just wanted to give you a quick overview of that, and we'll finish out in the third video.